who were the Samaritans? That is the question that I find most people have some semblance of an answer to, but when you want to talk about specifics, there's just not a whole lot of understanding typically out there in the church about who the Samaritans were. This phrase right here in verse 4, and he had to pass through Samaria, is very, very interesting because it is sort of antithetical to everything that was culturally appropriate during the day and the time in which Jesus lived. Jewish people did everything they could to avoid going through Samaria in the first century. Where was Samaria exactly? Well, Samaria was located, at least during Jesus's time, right in the middle of the country. If you can see the map, if you're watching us on YouTube, or if you're watching this at all, anywhere, you can see the map that's on the screen. This is a map of Israel during Jesus's life and ministry. So first of all, actually, this entire area is the area that we now still know as Israel. The nation of Israel is back and established in the land once again. Although this little western, I should say, it's actually the eastern part of the country, is not technically part of Israel today, where you see places on here like Jericho and Bethlehem. Those places are actually in the West Bank currently. So that is not technically Israeli territory today. But in Jesus's time, this whole area belonged to Israel. But right smack dab in the middle of the country, there was this territory called Samaria, and that's where the Samaritans lived. Who were the Samaritans exactly? I'm going to answer that question in detail in just a second. But for now, what you need to know is that Jewish people who lived in Judea and in the north of the country in Galilee had a lot of animus towards Samaritans. These groups of people did not get along, the Jews and the Samaritans. So Jewish people often did everything they could to avoid traveling through Samaria. They would go around Samaria, usually to the east, and there were trails that they could walk to get from northern Israel and Galilee to southern Israel and Judea, where Jerusalem was located. Now, from Jerusalem to, say, Nazareth, the town that Jesus grew up in, you're talking about around a 65-mile straight shot if you're walking straight through Samaria. But most Jewish people, the vast majority, did not go straight through Samaria. They actually took an extra 2 or 3 days and went an extra 35 or 40 miles to go around the main body of Samaria. Jesus' disciples were surprised because he decided to travel right straight through the heart of Samaria. It would almost be like a Union soldier traveling through the heart of the southern states during the Civil War with his uniform on. It would have been risky. It would have been controversial. Some people might have been very upset. Some people might say you're in danger by traveling through this area like this. You shouldn't be here. This is what Jesus decided to do. And the way John describes it in chapter 4 is by saying he had to do it. Jesus had to pass through Samaria. Why did Jesus have to pass through Samaria? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. So who were the Samaritans? That is the question that I find most people have some semblance of an answer to, but when you want to talk about specifics, there's just not a whole lot of understanding typically out there in the church about who the Samaritans were. The Samaritans, understanding who the Samaritans were, takes us all the way back into the heart of the Old Testament. You might remember that when God established the nation of Israel, after he freed them from slavery in Egypt, and after 40 years in the wilderness, delivered them a land of their own, Canaan, which became the land of Israel, the country was unified for several hundred years under the rule of the judges and then under the rule of the first 3 kings of unified Israel, that being Saul, David, and David's son, Solomon. But after Solomon's reign, the tribes split up, and specifically the 10 northern tribes in the country rebelled and said, we are not going to any longer operate or live under the rulership of the house of David, By this time, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was actually the king of Israel until the 10 northern tribes rebelled and followed a man called Jeroboam the first. There's another Jeroboam who was a king of Israel who comes up a couple hundred years later, who reigned during the time that Jonah the prophet was actually on the earth and prophesying. But the reason that the 10 tribes in the north rebelled and the reason that Israel was divided, actually, it says, was because God was bringing judgment on the people because of Solomon's sin. You actually read this in 1 Kings chapter 11. God says to Solomon, after you're gone, the kingdom's going to be divided because your heart has been carried away after idols. And the people in the north, particularly, were already trending toward worshiping idols and turning away from God and doing all the things that God had told the Israelites not to do. Don't be like the people who possessed the land before you. So after Solomon's reign, the nation divides up. There's 10 northern tribes who make up now the kingdom of Israel in the north. And there's 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, who make up the southern kingdom of Judah. Fast forward a few hundred years to 722 BC. The Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. And what the Assyrians would do when they conquered a nation is take all the people from that nation that they conquered, take them back to Assyria, and then scatter them all over their empire. And then they would take people from other nations that they conquered and scatter them all over their empire. So several years after 722, when the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered, what you have are pagan people from other countries and other territories who have been conquered by the Assyrians coming back to the territory that had formerly been northern Israel. And you have all these Israelites who are scattered everywhere else. Now, eventually, what happened was the people who were living in Israel, and this is actually recorded also in the Old Testament, the people who were living in Israel, in the territory of northern Israel, under Assyrian rule, were getting devoured by animals. God was bringing judgment on them because they were living in the land that he gave to his people, but they were not following his customs and they were not worshiping him. So the Assyrians actually had Jewish priests brought back to live in the land and to teach the people Jewish customs. Eventually, what happened was, I hope you're still following this, Jewish people who had been scattered all over the known world by the Assyrians started making their way back to northern Israel, the territory I'm talking about. And what you had was this amalgamation, this mixing of people who had been relocated to Israel and who had started to learn Jewish customs, but who were not actually Jewish, and people who were ethnically Jewish, but who had been living other places, come back to the land and mix together and become what we now call, and what the Jews in Jesus's day called, the Samaritans. Okay. Why were they called the Samaritans? They were called the Samaritans because in the 9th century AD, under the rule of King Omri, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel became the city of Samaria, and it remained the capital of Israel until the Assyrians conquered that nation and that kingdom. So who were the Samaritans? They were more or less a mix of people who were both ethnically Jewish and not ethnically Jewish. Some of them were the direct ancestors of Jewish people who were part of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, who lived in Samaria, in the territory in northern Israel, who followed Jewish law, Jewish custom, believed that Yahweh was the one true God, but who had a different set of traditions and a different Bible than Jewish people, those who were the descendants of the 2 southern tribes who made up the kingdom of Judah that stuck around for a couple hundred years after Israel was taken over by Assyria. I hope y'all are following this. I know it's a lot of history, a lot of cultural context, but this is what we have to do in order to really understand who the Samaritans were. what made the Samaritans different than Jewish people? Well, not only were they ethnically mixed, although by this time, by the time Jesus lived, they believed they were the descendants of Abraham. They only read the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Old Testament, also called the Tanakh. They only read the first 5 books, which is also called the Torah or the law. So they only had in their Bible Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's sort of like how today in Orthodox and Catholic churches, they have more books in their Bible than we do as Protestants. We actually might touch more on that later on in this episode. So the Samaritans only had the Torah, and they did not consider Jerusalem to be the holy place where God was to be worshiped like the Jews did. The reasons for that we'll get into a little bit later in the episode, because that actually comes up between the Samaritan woman and Jesus when they're having a conversation with one another. So look, that's a lot of info, like I said, but I hope you understand a little bit more about who the Samaritans were. I believe by the time Jesus was alive, they were different enough to be able to recognize who was Samaritan and who was Jewish. So in other words, I believe that when Jesus was sitting at this well, which we're going to get to right now, and this Samaritan woman walks up to him, she immediately recognized that he was Jewish, not Samaritan. Now, a Roman soldier, maybe, who's stationed in the land, who's not familiar with these cultures and these contexts, who was there at the time living in Israel, but who didn't know any better, probably wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between a Jew and a Samaritan. But Samaritans and Jews probably certainly did. They probably sounded different. They probably dressed a little different. And there was certainly a lot of animus between the two groups. How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. So a little bit more history here. Let's get into why the Jews and the Samaritans had hostility. It's not that they were just descendants of different tribes who had been split up for hundreds of years. Jews felt like the Samaritans they felt like the Israelites, who now were the Samaritans, had rebelled against the rightful king of Israel, David, and his household. There was more recent reasons for there to be hostility. So in the 2nd century BC, the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, the people of Israel were ruled by one of the 4 generals who had Alexander the Great's kingdom divided up amongst themselves. They were ruled by a man whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was a Greek Seleucid king. Okay, follow me now. And in the 2nd century, he tried to basically de-Judaize all of the Jewish people who were living in Israel. He didn't want this monotheistic religion to exist anymore. He didn't want there to be Jews who were doing their own thing religiously, worshiping other gods. One thing you'll learn the more you study the history of the New Testament is that Greeks and Romans really valued polytheism, and they really valued religious tolerance. They wanted all the religions of the world to tolerate each other and to get along together. This was really hard for the Jews because they believed in one true God and worshiping him and him alone. So in the 2nd century, Antiochus Epiphanes basically comes to Jerusalem, defiles the temple, and tries to force the Jews to give up their religion and their customs. And a man named Judas Maccabeus led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire. And this story is told in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are in the apocryphal books of the New Testament, the books that are not the apocryphal books of the Bible, the books that are not included in the Protestant Bible, but are included in the Catholic and Orthodox Bible. This eventually led to Israel becoming an independent state for about 80 years. And that dynasty became known as the Hasmonean dynasty until the Romans came in and quashed it once again and installed Herod the Great as the emperor just years before Jesus was born. But during that revolt, in that rebellion in the 2nd century BC, the Samaritans did not side with the Jews. They did not support them. They did not fight alongside them. So there was deep hostility between these two groups because of this more recent historical event. Besides the fact that they also had developed different customs over the years, and they basically had two different Bibles. I mean, not completely different, but like I said, the Samaritans only read the first 5 books. So by the time Jesus is on the scene, the typical Jewish person views Samaritans very, very, very lowly. Like they're almost as bad as Gentiles. They're unclean. They're defiled. They don't honor the prophets. They don't respect our traditions. They are not Jews. They do not worship. Well, do they worship a different God? That's debatable whether Jews thought that Samaritans actually worshiped a different God, but there was certainly debate about where to worship, how to worship, and things like this. Now, Samaritan women were considered particularly unclean. Why is this? To be honest, I can't really give you a great answer as to why that is, other than to say that prejudice always seems to focus its ire on the weakest members of a group, if we look at it historically. So Samaritans were all considered unclean. Samaritan women were considered very unclean. I'm going to give you an example of just how bad this was culturally in order to sort of prove this. Within a generation of Jesus's own life, Jewish leaders codified a law in Jerusalem, and this is actually written, you can go find it in the Mishnah, which said this: Samaritan women, this is a little graphic and intense, so I'm just warning you. This was a Jewish law that was codified within a generation of Jesus's life. Samaritan women are menstruants from their cradle, and therefore perpetually in a state of ceremonial uncleanness. This is what was thought about Samaritan women by the typical Jewish religious man in the 1st century, that Samaritan women are constantly menstruating from the time they're babies, and they're always unclean. Do you see why when this woman sees Jesus, a Jewish man, sitting at the well, her guard immediately goes up, and she sort of assumes, you get the sense from early on in the conversation, that he's not her friend. And she's actually confused as to why this man is even talking to her, which has its own sort of cultural taboo around it. So let's keep going into the passage, and then we'll get into now more of the back and forth between Jesus and this woman, and see why this is such a powerful encounter, why it's so important that John included this in his gospel. Thanks for watching. My name is Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video, and also check out this video right here.